let's not make it a blanket exception. I mean, I have a personal view about that, but the process ought to be not that one right always trumps the other, but there is a consideration of each case on its merits.
But you would, as a general rule, keep the exemptions pretty narrow?
No, I wouldn't have exemptions. I'd say that the way the human rights should work is that often there is a balancing of different rights. I mean, some rights are absolute. We say the right to be free from torture or other forms of cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment is something that shouldn't be compromised in any way. But you might have issues of the right to free speech, for example, as against the right to privacy, and there can be a range of other circumstances in which rights impinge on each other. And this is one, the right to freedom of religion. If you say, for example, that, as I gather some religions do, that homosexuality is contrary to their religious views, well, let's look at that and let's see how central it is and see how your freedom of religion is impacted by that, and let's examine that against the right to equality, which we should affirm as a general principle, not always subservient to the freedom of religion, which is the current position.
Mm. Robert Clark, do you think we currently have the balance about right?
Well, as you've said, and as Brian has said, it is a question of balance. Our side of politics pioneered equal opportunity legislation in Victoria under the Hamer government, and then with further changes under the Kennett government. Our concern with the legislation that was passed recently is that it pushes the balance too far in one direction, to the point where it's becoming very intrusive on people's freedom of association, either for religious reasons or indeed for other reasons. And probably the starkest way of demonstrating that it's gone, or demonstrating the inconsistencies within the government's policy in this, is that the bill allows a total exemption from the legislation in relation to political parties' freedom of association, whereas it imposes very heavy and onerous restrictions, for example, on the ability of faith-based schools to select their staff. You can imagine the reaction if Rob Holes were to be told, for example, that it would be prima facie discrimination for him to exclude from his personal staff applicants who were Liberals, and that he would need to justify that on a case-by-case basis. I expect he would reply that surely he was entitled to select his personal staff from amongst those who agreed with his side of politics. But yet the tests that have been imposed on various community-based organisations are far more restrictive than that. They're quite ambiguous, but even on the most favourable interpretations, they're very onerous. And on the least favourable interpretations, they would render the ability of faith-based and many other community organisations to carry out their functions. And their argument is quite a simple one, that when they're engaging staff to serve at their school or whatever it might be, that they are entitled to look for staff who support the ethos of the school. And when parents select, for example, a school for their children, they're entitled to look for a school that will deliver on the ethos that it sets out to uphold.
A Christian maths teacher, is that what's required?
Well, many schools will say, and indeed it's not only a matter of religion, but other schools have other non-religious standards or ethos, that they want to ensure the staff who are role models for their students in whatever their ethos is. So it's a question of judgment as to how far you push on that. And I have to say, I fear that if that this bill, as passed and when it comes into force, is going to push very intrusively into what is normally be regarded as people's freedom of association and people's freedom to live life in accordance with their faith. And I think, be that Christian faith or Jewish faith or Muslim faith or Buddhist faith or whatever, when you start intruding on those aspects that are so core to people's beliefs and a way of life, then it's going to provoke a very hostile reaction, and indeed is likely to undermine rather than promote the sort of goodwill and tolerance and openness for which Australia fortunately has been very well known.
Now, Robert Clark, we've been talking about large organisations, schools or political parties. In your second reading speech, when the amendments to the Equal Opportunity Act were introduced, you criticised the bill for removing the previous exceptions and exemptions for small business. Why should discrimination be acceptable for small business but not for other organisations?
Well, in short, when you're in a small organisation, interpersonal relationships are fundamental to how that business operates. And if you force people to work together in a close environment in a small business, it is likely to not work. And to force people to engage together in that, it could well destroy the business. For similar reasons, there have been sort of thresholds for the application of partnership exemptions. So whereas if you're in a larger organisation, you're more able to operate on dispassionate lines, and where personal associations and the interrelationships between a small number of people is less crucial.
Brian Walters, do you have a view?
Yes, I spent 25 years running a small business, being Wild Magazine as one of the directors, as well as my legal practice, and I think it is unacceptable for small businesses to be able to discriminate on grounds that are inappropriate. For example, refusing to employ an otherwise appropriate person because they're gay. Why should that be acceptable in a small business? I don't think it should be. I think that's a value that we shouldn't allow. And we should uphold equality in that context. And I think that small business can deal with that and frees up a whole lot of the community, people who are otherwise be marginalised, to participate more fully. We have a better community.
And what do you say to the argument that interpersonal relationships are very important in small organisations, and maybe there's room for letting like be with like?
Well, interpersonal relationships are important in all classes and walks of life, from family through to business, through to politics. It's crucial. And the fact that it is important makes it all the more reason that we shouldn't licence discrimination. We shouldn't permit that to happen.
Let's talk about the courts and the justice system. The current government has introduced a series of new courts and new divisions in existing courts, and it's been done in an attempt to tackle the social causes of crime and family violence. So, for example, here in Victoria we have a neighbourhood justice centre which has been established in the city of Yarra. We have Koori courts for our Indigenous community. We have drug courts. We have specialised family violence and mental health lists. I'm wondering what you both feel about this approach. Does it, as some say, undermine the idea that everyone is equal before the law and subject to the same courts? Robert Clark?
Well, we're getting what can best be described as patchwork justice in Victoria at the moment, where the way you are handled, the rights and treatment you receive in a court depends very much on where you live. If you're in Yarra, you may go to the Neighbourhood Justice Centre and be treated in one way. If you're in Broadmeadows, you may go to the court there and be treated in another way. To the extent to which these programs are running on a trial basis, that may well be reasonable. But I think if it gets to, and when it is now starting to get to the point where these trials have been held and views can be formed about them, you have to ask yourself, well, is it appropriate to continue to discriminate between people depending on where they live? And I've been particularly critical, for example, of what's happened with the Neighbourhood Justice Centre in Collingwood, because anecdotally it seems to be achieving some good results. But although the government had a detailed